Okay, so then there's no writing on. So so the reason we're doing this is because we don't have a whiteboard or something on which we can write, or a chalkboard or a blackboard, and there was some discussion of making some kind of a screen with a pad, what do you call it, and a stylus that will be Nehua. But so we didn't do that either. So we have the whole proof that we're going to go through today, written out in detail behind me. I have it on my computer, so I'm going to be talking about that. And then there's the what's on the screen that was sent to you as a document. Well, strictly speaking, it wasn't sent to you. I should have said it was uploaded to a Google Drive. And so it must be on Google Docs somewhere. The link was disseminated yesterday. I don't know if we have to send it out again. Some of the people may not have been here when maybe Sayyid Ali Rallah comes back. We can do that. Apparently people are running behind, so let's just wait for him to come back, and then we'll commence. Sabrun Jamil. I think he has to set up because it's transmitting live and all of that, live feed.
Yeah, he's probably setting up the live stream right now.
If we're live already, that's great. Hello. Huh?
Do we have, do you know where Shabir Uncle keeps his whiteboard?
I do. It's in Sunday school office. It's a small white board.
No, it's not going to work. We need like a classroom size,
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
9 meters or 96 inches or whatever it is,
Gotcha.
length. That's a proper.
Yeah, that one is like, big.
Which is fun. I like to do that. We don't have to have that. It's okay.
Why you were interested in this topic?
Why not?
No, just this is because of your curiosity, or?
I suppose, yes. I mean,
No, there are so many thousands of different millions of topics, but you chose
you'd be
this one.
surprised. I'm interested in most of those.
Oh.
So, no, in all honesty, I mean, the world of academia is very over-specialized, and I am more of a person who is interested. I have a very, very, very wide range. I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that. I don't want to brag either, but I read very, very widely, and I read deeply as well. And if I was to really try and classify myself, I would hope to be a philosopher in the original sense of the word, which was originated by Pythagoras, which means not a wise person, but a lover of wisdom, a seeker of knowledge and wisdom of all kinds. And the ancient Greek philosophers said that philosophy, the true origin of philosophy is in wonder, is in amazement. And I'm amazed by almost everything I see in the world. And that generates a curiosity, a genuine curiosity, which is the beginning of all real learning. And Aristotle in the Metaphysics says that all human beings have an innate desire to understand things. So I think that is the best answer that can be given to your question, sir. Obviously, you are here, so you are interested in it. Why are you interested in it?
No, because I never have this topic, I don't have enough knowledge, so that's why So I want to learn and understand.
Precisely. You're exactly showing exactly what Aristotle said is correct. Human beings have an innate desire to understand their universe, understand their world, understand their life, understand their immediate surroundings. And then further on to that, they have an innate desire to communicate to others, with their fellow human beings. So these things are all there.
Do you think that originates from greed, the greed to know more than the others?
Grade?
Greed, because...
G-R-A-D-E? Grade?
G-R-E-E-D.
Greed.
Greed.
Yes. Humans are just necessarily greedy.
No, greed is not a virtue, it is a vice. And so then and the true seeking of knowledge, if one truly seeks knowledge for its own sake, then it cannot be characterized as greed. There are people who seek presumably knowledge, but more and more in our times, not really genuine knowledge, but the mere acquisition of credentials and pieces of paper. And there's a certain amount of, a degree of the nafs in that, the lower soul, and the desire to appear intelligent and to argue with people and make the other person look stupid, and to seek out the rewards and trappings of career and privilege in a better parking space, and at least in the context of the university, assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, or lecturer, reader, professor in the UK system, and then your special parking space and privileges with the dean, this grant and that grant, and blah, blah, blah. That's what it is. If that's what you mean, yes, but the true seeking of knowledge cannot be motivated by greed. That's maybe the one area where competition and this kind of thing is to be encouraged. But so to greed, no, I don't think that really applies. But the person who really is interested in knowledge, it's not really greed. They're constantly in thirst of knowledge. They want more. So it's similar to greed in as much as that's what you mean, yes. But the true seeking of knowledge cannot be motivated by greed. That's maybe the one area where competition and this kind of thing is to be encouraged. And so this is coming. So to greed, no, I don't think that really applies. But the person who really is interested in knowledge, it's not really.
No, he's checking. So
So उसका मतलब, yeah, what I meant to say is that there is this notion of desire for more. Now there are those who seek worldly success and they seek, wealth. And you'll often find with wealthy people, they've got $300 million and 20 Rolls Royces, and they need a 21st Rolls Royce, and they need to make $1 million more. So it's similar in that sense. A person who really loves knowledge, he wants to learn more. He wants to learn another subject. He wants to, go on. Are we live now?
We are live now.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No.
Okay. Sure.
I hope that answers your question. But we can come back to that.
Okay. This is today's day 2, part 2 of our seminar series on debunking atheism. Yesterday, Dr. Sayyid Nizam laid down the foundations of the logic so that we could understand at least the arguments today and the whole, basically, the logical proof against atheism. So without further delay, I'd like to pass the mic over to Dr. Sayyid Nizam.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على النبي المؤيد والرسول المسدد سيدنا أبي القاسم محمد صل على محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا الله. To proceed, yesterday was the first installment of this 2-day seminar on atheism, and in the first installment I made a kind of argument for what I call the faith of unbelief. The reigning zeitgeist or spirit of our times is that of atheism, secularism, scientism. We live in an unprecedented age in the history of mankind in which the sacred, what the historian of religion, Rudolf Otto, called the idea of the holy, the notion of the sacred realm has been completely rejected. And it is the first time in the history of mankind that we have the edifice of what purports to be a civilization raised upon the denial of the sacred order. And in effect, the ideology of this so-called civilization is what I call the faith of unbelief, in as much as it is not a religion. It is a kind of anti-religion or an inversion of religion, but it functions like a religion. It's functionally equivalent to a religion. And so in the first installment, we spoke about some of the high priests, so to speak, of this, what is called the New Atheism. And I said that what is new in the New Atheism is not really much new, because denial of God is quite ancient. There were those who denied the sacred order in the ancient world, but they were never really in charge. They were never really the leaders of society. And in the modern age, we have this thing called the New Atheism. What's different about it is it's just much more brazen and shrill in its denunciation of religion. And because of our particular historical situation, we have all these kinds of mass media now that, the official mass media anyway, have lionized these persons like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. All of these gentlemen are alive with the exception of Mr. Hitchens, who is deceased now. And so after that, I spoke a bit about exactly what atheism is, because it's extremely important to define our terms, and we did that, I think, rather carefully last time by actually referring to what we may call canonical works of atheist discourse and polemic, namely Atheism, the Case Against God by George H. Smith, which, to be fair, Smith actually wrote a very nice book. It's very well written, it's well organized, he has an excellent command of the English language, and he's trained in philosophy, and he tries to present a philosophical case against God. Dawkins does not do this in his very famous and very well-selling and popular book, The God Delusion. So after we went through these definitional matters, we then looked at the argument which Dawkins attempts, to make the case that God does not exist. That is in chapter 4 of his book. And he summarized that in 6 points, and we went through those 6 numbered points, actually 6 paragraphs, 6 short paragraphs. And Dawkins does this even though, and he's not very, he doesn't really have an understanding of philosophy. He hasn't studied the philosophical proofs for the existence of God, unlike Smith. But the interesting thing from Smith that we got, which I spoke about yesterday, was that atheism is a negative position. It is one in which it simply means the absence of a belief in God. And so Smith argues that inasmuch as atheism is privative in this sense, it is not in need of proof. In other words, the burden of proof is upon the theist. And if we take the notion of Anthony Flew, another person whom I mentioned, important atheist philosopher who before the end of his life, interestingly enough, became a theist and became a believer in God before he died, he speaks of what's called the presumption of atheism, just as in, it's a principle of common law that you are innocent until proven guilty. So it's similar to that. He says that we must presume that God exists unless his existence is proven otherwise, unless it's proven otherwise that he exists. Excuse me. So that is a kind of a thumbnail of what we went over yesterday. Then there was a lot of Q&A, question, answer, and so forth. And I concluded by saying that we would go through a detailed proof for the existence of God. We would take up the challenge, as it were. If the burden of proof is on the theist, well, all right, here it is. To this end, we also spent a good deal of time on absolutely necessary logical preliminaries, because a lot of people ask questions nowadays, but they are not in a position to understand the answer because they haven't studied logic. Logic is absolutely fundamental, and we won't repeat any of that today, but we spent a great deal of time yesterday in carefully giving you a summary of logic, or as best as possible, in a little brief talk. I mean, I said, you could spend, to really study logic, you need to spend about a year. It's a year-long course and go through it very carefully. So this is a proof for the existence of God, which we will examine today. We went through documents already. Let me situate myself in the document. This document has been made available. Is that link available? Isn't it on one of the Google? Google. It's a Google document. It's on Google Drive somewhere. All right. So, this is a proof for the existence of God, which argues from the notion of contingency to necessity, in as much as God is seen as necessary being, or the necessarily existent. And the proofs for the existence of God are often classified by philosophers, by people in religious studies, into different groups. So we have a broad group of arguments, in the plural, what are called cosmological arguments, and Ibn Sina's proof is an instance of a cosmological argument. What is the cosmological argument? In very simple terms, a cosmological argument takes as its starting point some feature of the cosmos or some element of the universe, and from that, through a chain of propositions, presumably certain propositions, yaqini propositions, and argues then from there and proceeds from there to a conclusion. And if all of the terms in each of those propositions are clear and unambiguous, and if the propositions are true and the argument form is valid, then by the laws of logic, the conclusion is also certain, is guaranteed, is established. Now, there are other kinds of arguments. There's what's also called ontological arguments. They have something, or they involve existence, being, or wujud in some way as the starting point to prove the existence of God. Generally speaking, philosophers who are very careful tend not to take such arguments to be decisive or even convincing, and some even reject some of them. One of the most famous, at least in the Western world, is known as the ontological argument of Anselm of Canterbury. And we're not going to talk about that, but people don't often like this one. There are other kind of ontological arguments, and the reason is because you've assumed existence as part of your starting point, and you're proving the existence of God, and you're essentially identifying God with existence. And so in terms of the logical structure, and we're not going to go into the technical details because they are not really important for our purposes. So some of the more careful and strict philosophers who are very interested in very strict logical exactitude, they do not like those kind of arguments. All right. There's another argument known as the argument by design. We spoke about that, or design arguments as a group. And in effect, Dawkins' attempt at arguing against the existence of God is really a kind of attempt to answer design arguments. Now, there were some ladies who were here yesterday, and there was much discussion about what is called intelligent design. So I only speak of design arguments. Intelligent design has almost become a movement now, which is associated with certain Christian proclivities, and has a lot to do with evolution and arguing against the Darwinian theory of evolution. We're not here to discuss and debate that. One can have various philosophical objections to the theory of evolution. One could have scientific objections to the theory of evolution. One could also have philosophical and scientific evidences and arguments for the theory of evolution. That is not our topic. However, some of the people who were attending yesterday were interested in that. I said I was not well informed on this subject. And nevertheless, one of the questioners asked for certain books on the topic. So I promised this person that I would come back with that. They aren't here, but this is being recorded. Maybe they're watching, so I must answer the question. So there are three interesting books on this topic. One is called Darwin's Black Box. And the other one, They're by the same person. Darwin's Black Box is by someone named Michael. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. Behe. I don't know if that's Behe or Behe. I have no idea how to pronounce it. Then he's written another book on Darwin's theory of evolution against it. And he's, I think, a molecular biologist or a biochemist. So he's proceeding on presumably some arguments based in his field of expertise. And then there's another one by Stephen Murray, and I can't remember the title of that. I thought I had them on my computer, but I don't. But if you search under Stephen Murray, you will find that's a rather large book. I think I sent you an email, Ali. Did you? Can you check it if you don't mind?
Sure.
And we can get the titles. I don't have it here now. All right, so that's just an answer to that question.
There's Darwin devolves science.
Oh, Darwin Devolves. That's Michael Behe's second book. Then
Darwin doubts explosive origin intelligence.
Darwin Doubted or Darwin's
Darwin's doubt.
Darwin's Doubt. Yeah, Darwin's Doubt is the one by Stephen Murray. Meyer, sorry. Stephen Meyer. I stand corrected. So that's the answer for whoever asked that question yesterday, if they're listening, or someone who watches the first video. Anyway, they have the answer to that. So now, how then do we proceed with this argument? So Ibn Sina is an extremely important figure in the history of Islamic philosophy, and his name is really associated with this argument. Now, there are other kinds of cosmological argument. And I think, at least in terms of the works which I have seen and which I have read, probably the best study of this is of cosmological arguments, philosophically and historically, but primarily philosophical, is by a Christian Protestant philosopher and theologian named William Lane Craig. So he wrote a very scholarly presentation of these cosmological arguments, and it's entitled simply The Cosmological Argument from Plato to Leibniz. So he looks at a number of figures. And so some form of cosmological argument has been used by Plato. The most famous one is probably that by Aristotle in his book called The Physics. There were cosmological arguments, of course, used by Ibn Sina. There were cosmological arguments employed by the Jewish rabbi and philosopher Maimonides, who grew up in the Islamic world and wrote in Arabic. His Arabic name is Musa, Abu Imran Musa ibn Maymun al-Isra'ili. There's Sa'ad al-Fayyumi, another Jewish scholar and rabbi. He also used he also resorted to cosmological arguments. There's St. Thomas Aquinas, who is considered to be a giant figure in Catholicism even to this day, and his doctrines are considered, as my understanding, to be definitive for Catholics. The Western philosopher Leibniz also used a kind of cosmological argument. So it has a very long history. But I think that Ibn Sina's version is the most interesting for reasons which will become clear in the course of the coming hour and a half or whatever it is, 2 hours. A historical word here, a word about about history here is in order. Ibn Sina's works, some of the writings of Ibn Sina were rendered into Latin. And in that form, they were read in Europe. And if you read Thomas Aquinas and various writings of his and certain of his proofs for the existence of God, the influence of Ibn Sina is palpable. You can see it. Now, that's one drawback of William Lane Craig's study. He doesn't know Arabic, but he reads through when he presents Aquinas. And he presents Aquinas in great detail because Aquinas made many arguments in proving the existence of God in Summa Theologiae, also in Summa Contra Gentiles or Gentiles, depending on which way you want to pronounce Latin. And he also had a treatise on essence and existence in which he presents an argument for the existence of God. In all of these, that you can see a kind of influence of Ibn Sina, because it sounds very similar. If you read Ibn Sina, if you read the Shifa, if you read al-Isharat wa tanbihat, the Shifa is called the healing. Isharat wa tanbihat is remarks and admonitions. These are significant works of Ibn Sina. At any rate, that's important to note, because oftentimes that's just not acknowledged. Now, I don't know if that's because people don't know or they don't want to acknowledge. That's another matter. But my guess is people often don't know Arabic. It wasn't until very recently, for example, that the metaphysical portion of Kitab al-Shifa by Ibn Sina was even available in English. And even after it's available in English, how many people read these things? How many people read, even in the scholarly world, in academia, you can only read so much. You have to get tenure. They play all sorts of games. And as far as the general public is concerned, does people in the general public really read anything? It's all social media and phone and I don't know, Snapchat, and I don't know what's going on, right? So it might well be because people don't know. But that's important to make this point, because this really is a very, very profound argument. All right, so having now said all this stuff and beating around the bush, let's really dive in. So this proof is based on Ibn Sina's famous proof by contingency. And it is an attempt to present a modern form of this argument. And now I have lost my place. When I say that this is an attempt to present a modern version or modern form of this argument, what I mean is that Ibn Sina doesn't really present it in this way. But the fundamental notions which are going to be employed, namely that of contingency and necessity, are absolutely key to what is this? I don't know what's going on here. Forget it. I'll read it like this. So Ibn Sina does not really present the argument in these words, obviously. He's not going to speak in this language. He doesn't use the kind of symbols and so forth which we're going to use. I'm sorry about this. I don't understand why this form of the... Open a PDF is better. Here. That's nicer. We don't have to mess around with the document. Ibn Sina doesn't resort to the various sorts of logical symbols and so forth, which we'll be resorting to, and so forth. Also, there have been attempts also to make proofs for the existence of God in modern times, by which I have been influenced in writing this. So there is a book called New Proofs for the Existence of God by Spitzer. And he presents a very similar kind of argument here, but I've adapted the form which he has used and employed, the terminology of Ibn Sina. So now we have to define our terms and get into the proof. So where does Ibn Sina present this argument? He presents it in kind of a schematic form in his Isharat wa tanbihat, or what's known as remarks and admonitions, where he calls it the proof of the superbly veracious, or Burhan al-Siddiqeen, excuse me. Why does he call it the proof of the superbly veracious? It's because he considers this proof to be superior to all proofs offered before him. Why? He considers it to be based on the notion of existence itself. Existence not as an individually existing thing, existence as actualized in a pen or a book or a table or a chair, but existence as such, or al-wujud. Al-wujud min haythu huwa al-wujud, or existence qua existence, being qua being, or in Persian we would call it hasti, and that's understood in Urdu as well. And since it is based on existence itself, he deems it to be superior to all other proofs, inasmuch as it's not based on cause and effect, for example, or some other element of the universe, but on existence itself. So how does it begin? To proceed, first we must acknowledge that the cosmos, or if you prefer the universe, exists, i.e. we must concede that it is real. Now, I hope that this would not be disputed, but nevertheless there might be some people who would dispute that, but I trust that this is not disputed by anyone in this room. We then observe that in all that we encounter there are a web of relationships interconnecting a vast range of things together on every scale of observation and experience. To take an arbitrary example, consider a creature such as a horse. For any given horse, its existence is contingent. And I'm motivating the definition here in this discourse. The existence of that horse is contingent. That is to say, it depends on something else. In Arabic, we would say that that horse is mumkin. But if you translate that as possible, that's not really what it means. The term is contingent. And if you want to know the difference, as I said yesterday, go and look up the word in the Oxford English Dictionary. That's the place where you should go to look up words in the English language. So for any given horse, its existence is contingent on a host of other things. That is to say, a horse, considered even in and of itself, depends on all of the physical elements that make it a horse. In other words, its bones, its muscles, its organs, the staggering variety of cells that make up all its tissues, as well as the structure of those cells, the molecular structure of those cells, the atomic structure of the individual molecules, the subatomic structure of those molecules, the four fundamental forces of gravity, electromagnetism, the weak force, and the strong force, or the weak nuclear force and the strong nuclear force, and so on. Not to mention the associated biological, chemical, physiological, molecular, atomic, subatomic processes involving the harmonious functioning of all these elements working together, which altogether make it a horse. Without all of this, the horse would not exist. The same sort of observations apply to a tree, a block of granite, or anything in the cosmos. Namely, that all such phenomena are contingent, or that they constitute contingent entities. That is to say, in Arabic, they are all mumkinat. So here, we must define what is meant by a contingent entity. Having motivated this, we now offer a definition. It is very important to define your terms in logic. We explained this yesterday. So a contingent entity is any entity that is dependent on another entity for its existence or occurrence. Now note here, this entity need not be a solid object like a stone or an animal. It could be even a particle, a so-called particle in physics. A proton, a neutron. It could be a field, that is in a magnetic field, an electromagnetic field, a wave structure, a temperature gradient, the spatiotemporal continuum, any kind of a physical law as well. And these elaborations here I have taken from Spitzer's book. I think I brought it here, yes. New Proofs for the Existence of God. This is a very interesting book, but it's a very sophisticated and technical book. So those of you who have studied logic before, or if you've studied mathematics, this is going to be very much like that. This is like a proof from a math class. So as you can see, we're defining our terms. So we've defined contingent entity. The second definition is that of what we call a condition. So we note that a given contingent entity may itself function as a condition for another contingent entity. In which case we describe the given contingent entity as a condition for the other contingent entity. Thus, a condition is a contingent entity on which another contingent entity depends. So when we considered all of the factors on which the contingent entity of horse depends, those are conditions, but those things in themselves also are contingent entities. Naturally, we can also envisage a plurality of such contingent entities, and thus we may speak in the plural of conditions and contingent entities, or if you like, of contingencies. Now you may think this is all very tedious and pedantic, but it has to be if we want to come up with a logical demonstration, or what we called an apodictic proof yesterday, that is to say, that which is a true burhan. in logic. The third definition is that of necessary being. A natural question now poses itself. Is there an utterly non-contingent entity or reality? By non-contingent entity or reality, we mean an entity that does not depend on any other entity of any kind for its existence or occurrence, and which we term necessary being. Wajibul wujud in Arabic. Yes. Interesting. Yeah. Clearly, the existence of contingent entities subject to a vast range of yet further contingencies is not a matter of dispute, for they exist all around us. Thus, let us pose the following question. In all of reality, there either is no non-contingent entity, which thus would mean that there is no necessary being, or there is at least one non-contingent entity, which is just to say that at least one necessary being does exist. So we have two propositions here. It is important to understand that this is called a complete disjunction in logic. We say, here we use the language of contingencies and contingency and necessity, but we have two propositions. Either God exists or God does not exist. Now, we are obviously calling the utterly non-contingent entity, necessary being, we are calling it by the word God, or we're calling it God. Now, certain atheist philosophers would argue that, you've defined God at the beginning. We are saying that this is what it is. This is what we are going to try and establish. And they'll say, well, that doesn't correspond to God. And usually they mean the Christian God, Muslim God, or the God of theism, by which they mean all of these attributes. Well, we haven't gotten to that yet. If you want to establish divine attributes, and they say, well, only establish the existence of, if this proof holds, and I think it does, then that only establishes the existence of a God. How do you explain that it's the only one? So that's another step which has to be proved. Then you have to prove various other things. So we'll see how far we can get with this, but I hope only to prove the existence of necessary being, and then I will prove that the necessary being is unique. And as far as the divine attributes and so on and so forth, and we have to do this for a semester or something then, or a series of other lectures. So it is important then to understand that we have two propositions. This is what's called a complete disjunction. You have one proposition on this side. We have one proposition, and then we have another proposition, which is the negation of that proposition. We have P or not P. And they are mutually exclusive. That's what we mean by a complete disjunction. These two, and only these two propositions, cover all logical possibilities. They are mutually exclusive by the law of excluded middle, which says that there is no third option. We looked at this yesterday. Now, in what follows, we shall attempt to determine which of these propositions is true through logical demonstration. Now let us repeat these two propositions here on paper, so to speak, on screen, and the complete disjunction. Complete disjunction in logic is denoted by a big letter V, a large letter V, which is read as or. It's not read as V, and it's not understood as against or versus as in law. Okay? So we have this big letter V. So proposition 1 we will symbolically denote by minus n or negative n, but it's not read as negative capital N. It's read as not n. So not n is the proposition, the first proposition, which states that there is no contingent entity in all of reality. Proposition 2 is that n, which is the negation of the negation, which is namely, there is at least one non-contingent entity in all of reality. And so the first disjunction, what I'm calling disjunction 1, you can see it back there, is either or not n or n, or not n or not n or n. So, equivalent forms of not n include, there is no necessary being in all reality. Another equivalent form is, in all reality there are only contingent entities. and there are only contingent entities in all of reality. Thus, if proposition 1 is established as false, then proposition 2 is not only true, it must be true, because it is a complete disjunction. These two propositions exhaust all possibilities. There is no third option by the law of excluded middle. That means that one and only one of these two disjunctive propositions can and must be true. Both can neither be false, nor can both be true at the same time in the same way. It is strictly one or the other, either or, not N or N. Let us now look at proposition 1 more closely. Under this proposition, for any contingent entity, call it capital C, it can depend on a finite number of conditions or an infinite number of conditions. This is also a complete disjunction. Thus, if not N is true, it must be one or the other, not neither, not both. Both options cannot be false, since all possibilities are exhausted by these two mutually exclusive options. Both cannot be true either, since this would violate the law of non-contradiction. Thus, under the proposition not N, we have in turn two further propositions which we denote by F and not F. So we've got our first disjunction, not N or N, then under not N we have another one which is F and not F. What does that mean? F is proposition 3, which states that any contingent entity C depends on a finite number of conditions. Proposition 4 is not F, which states that any contingent entity C depends on an infinite number of conditions. So we have F or not F. So proposition 3, again, which is denoted by F, shall hereinafter, for more clarity and convenience, be referred to as the finite hypothesis, and not F will, from now on, be called the infinite hypothesis. On the finite hypothesis, if any contingent entity C is dependent only on a finite number of conditions, call them small c1, c2, cn-1 up to cn. This entails that there exists at least one condition here, denoted by Cn, such that it is the most fundamental or the last condition or the final contingency or terminal condition on which the existence of C depends. So we have some contingent entity, and on the finite hypothesis, its conditions must end. There has to be a terminus, a last condition, as it were. So proposition 1, under that proposition which is not N, under which hypothesis F is being considered, asserts that there is no necessary being in all reality, which is true if and only if there are only contingent beings in all reality. Therefore, the final condition, Cn, on which the existence of any contingent entity or capital C depends, is also a contingent entity. Is that clear? Since we're considering it under hypothesis or proposition 1, which is not N. There is no, in other words, there are only contingent entities in all reality. So the terminal condition under that hypothesis also has to be contingent. Is there a question here? If there is, please ask it. You had your hand up.
So for little c1 through little cn,
Uh-huh.
do those like depend on each other, or are they just stick like?
No. They all depend on one another.
Okay. So like for example, the horse.
Except Cn, because on that hypothesis it's finite, so Cn has to be the last condition. But because this is being considered under proposition not N, what does proposition not N say? That means that that in all of existence there is no contingent entity. There are only contingent entities. You see, so I don't know. There seems to be some confusion here. Now, yeah. Mm.
It's kind of weird.
Yeah, proceed.
Think outside of the box here, but is there any type of circular contingency?
Yeah, that comes later. We will consider the circular argument later. Yeah. You see, if we ignore for the moment a circular set of conditions. Paragraph 1.3. Okay? So, once again, paragraph 1.2. proposition 1 is not n, right? That says that there is no non-contingent entity in all of reality, and we're considering the finite hypothesis under that. That asserts that there is no necessary being in all reality, which is true if and only if there are only contingent beings in all reality. The finite hypothesis says that there's only a finite number of them. All right, so let's consider a series of them. When you consider that series, then that last member also has to be contingent. Moving then to 1.3, and ignoring for the moment a circular set of conditions, then our last condition, Cn, must be a contingent entity whose conditions are not fulfilled. Why? Because the last condition, Cn, must also have conditions, since by proposition 1, which is not n, it too is a contingent entity. But its conditions cannot be fulfilled because it is supposed to be the terminating condition of the series according to the finite hypothesis. However, a contingent entity whose conditions are not fulfilled cannot be said to exist. It is literally no thing, nothing. And it therefore does not exist. It is non-existent. So if proposition not n combined with the finite hypothesis, namely f, requires that the most fundamental condition Cn be non-existent, then all contingent entities hypothetically dependent on it would also have to be non-existent, in which case the given contingent entity C would never exist. Therefore, no contingent entity can exist under proposition 1 not n with hypothesis f. Also, therefore, hypothesis f under not n must be false for all contingent entities C in all reality. We are thus left with what we termed above the infinite hypothesis. So we've eliminated hypothesis f. It leads to a contradiction, therefore it drops off. Because we have a complete disjunction, we are left now with the infinite hypothesis, or proposition not f, considered under proposition not n. Bear with me, please. This is very detailed, but it's a serious proof for the existence of God. So 1.5, section 1.5, the infinite hypothesis, or not f, entails what? It entails that for all contingent entities C, in all reality, C depends on an infinity of conditions. Before it depended on finite. Now we have an infinity of conditions. Let's call them, using lowercase, C1, C2, Cn minus 1, Cn, then Ci, all the way up to infinity. All of those have to be fulfilled for the existence of that contingent entity, capital C, which in turn entails that there is no condition C infinity, C subscript infinity, such that it is the most fundamental last, final, or terminal condition, because it goes to infinity. If there is no such terminal condition, then the number of, the word of is repeated here, conditions upon which any given contingent entity C depends is always one more than can ever be achieved, and therefore is unachievable. If any given contingent entity, capital C, depends on an unrealizable number of conditions being fulfilled for it to exist, then it will never exist. That is to say, any given contingent entity, capital C, depends on a condition, lowercase c subscript 1, which depends on a condition c subscript 2, which depends on a condition c subscript n minus 1, which depends on a condition c subscript n, which depends on a condition c subscript I ad infinitum, to infinity, in order for that contingent entity to come into existence. But capital C, that contingent entity, will never come into existence, since its conditions will never be fulfilled. Therefore, no contingent entity C can exist under the infinite hypothesis, not f, under proposition not n. Thus, both hypotheses are false under not n, which violates the law of non-contradiction, and thus means that proposition not n is also false. Now we only have the special case to deal with of a circular set of conditions. So, a circular set of conditions leads to the same result as above and may be seen simply as a special case of the finite hypothesis f and the infinite hypothesis not f under not n. So here we also have a complete disjunction. Here we will just refer to circle f and not circle f. Circle f being any contingent entity C depends on a circular set of finite number of conditions. Not circle f meaning any contingent entity C depends on a circular set of an infinite number of conditions. So we have our disjunction. We have circular F or not circular F, another complete disjunction. So let's take one horn of the dilemma, so to speak. Let's take one side of it. Consider hypothesis circular F. A circular set of conditions means a set of reciprocal conditions. Thus, under circle F, this set of conditions is finite and consists of conditions C1, C2, Cn minus 1, Cn, and then C1. We've gone in a circle. Notice that starting with C1, the circle is traversed until some Cn is reached, which must depend on C1, for that is what it means to have a circular set of conditions. Again, due to the reciprocal conditionality of a circular set of conditions, any of these conditions, call it C subscript capital L, may be construed as the last condition. In a circular set of conditions, any one of them can be the last so-called terminal or terminating condition. Since every condition then in the entire circular set of conditions is also contingent, then the putative last condition, C subscript capital L, must also be a contingent entity. However, its conditions are not fulfilled. Why? Because this proposed last condition, C subscript capital L, must also have conditions, since by proposition 1, there is no non-contingent entity in all of existence, in all of reality. It too is a contingent entity. But its conditions cannot be fulfilled because it is supposed to be the terminating condition of the circle of conditions to hypothesis circular F. However, a contingent entity whose conditions are not fulfilled cannot be said to exist at all. It is literally nothing, and therefore it does not exist. It is non-existence. So if proposition 1, not N, combined with hypothesis circular F, requires that the most fundamental condition, C subscript capital L, be non-existent, then all contingent entities hypothetically dependent on it would also have to be non-existent. In which case, the given contingent entity C would never exist. Therefore, no contingent entity can exist under proposition not N with hypothesis circular F. Therefore, hypothesis circular F under not N must also be false for all contingent entities C in all reality. We are thus left with what we termed above the infinite circular condition hypothesis not circle F under proposition not N. So under hypothesis not circle F, the circular set of conditions is infinite. So you have to imagine a circle with an infinite number of points on it, so to speak, which simply means we have a set of infinite conditions. In other words, C1, C2, Cn minus 1, Cn, Ci infinity that are reciprocally related in a circular fashion. This entails that every condition in the circle, Ci, without exception, must depend on an infinite number of conditions being fulfilled for its existence, which in turn entails that there is no condition C infinity such that it is the most fundamental, last, final, or terminal condition. Again, if no such terminal condition C infinity under hypothesis not circular F exists, then the number of conditions upon which any given contingent entity C depends is always one more than can ever be achieved and is therefore unachievable. If any given contingent entity C depends on an unrealizable number of conditions being fulfilled for it to exist, then it will never exist. That is to say, any given contingent entity C depends upon a condition C1, which depends on a condition C2, which depends on a condition Cn minus 1, which depends on a condition Cn ... which depends on some condition Ci ad infinitum in order for C to come into existence. But C will never come into existence since its conditions will never be fulfilled. Therefore, no contingent entity C can exist under the infinite circular hypothesis under proposition 1 either. Thus, both hypotheses, circular F and not circular F of disjunction 3 are false under proposition 1 and not, in other words, which is not N. And so, not N is also false. Thus, it is also seen that hypotheses circular F and not circular F are not alternatives to F and not F, but constitute a mere restatement of them. Which leads us to the conclusion. If hypothesis F and hypothesis not F are both false for any contingent entity under proposition 1, not N, namely that there is no non-contingent entity in all of reality, and if both hypotheses F and not F represent the whole range of possibilities for any contingent entity C, and if a circular set of conditions is not an alternative position to hypotheses F and not F, it being a mere restatement of them, then no contingent entity C can exist under both hypotheses F and not F. Section 2.1. If no contingent entity C can exist under either or both hypotheses F and not F, then there cannot be only contingent entities in all reality. Therefore, by disjunctive syllogism, proposition 1, namely not F, that there is no non-contingent entity in all of reality, is false. And proposition 2, N, which is that there is at least one non-contingent entity in all of reality, which is simply to say that there must be at least one necessary being in all reality, is true. To deny this conclusion would require affirming either hypothesis F or not F under proposition not N, or both. But as established in detail above, all such affirmations are absurd, for nothing would then be able to exist. It should be pointed out that whilst we uphold the impossibility of an infinite series, this is addressing a possible objection. It should be pointed out that whilst we uphold the impossibility of an actually infinite series, I should have said, the proof would still stand, even if we admitted the possibility of an actually infinite series. The reason for this is that, we should have the word actual there. The reason for this is that under hypotheses not F, any contingent entity, C, depends on an infinite chain of conditions. C1 up to infinity. Now, even if we admit the possibility of an actually infinite series, actualized in the external world, such an infinite chain of conditions remains contingent in aggregate, conceived of its totality. Since each of its conditions, C subscript I, is itself contingent, then so too will the infinite totality of all such conditions be nothing but contingent. Thus, such a chain of conditions will, even in its infinite totality, have to be grounded, as it were, in a non-contingent entity, transcending the proposed actual infinity of all such chains of conditions. What then is such an entity or reality, which we have termed necessary being, considered in itself? It is pure, unconditioned reality without any admixture of anything else. That is to say, it exists in and of itself, through itself, and is not a reality which is the cause of itself. It does not exist through the fulfillment of its supposed conditions, but rather through having no conditions. To assert that it is the cause of itself is to commit a fallacy known as causa sui in Latin. I need to assert that the necessary being is the cause of itself leads to a vicious circle, since it implies a reality existing before it existed in order to make itself exist. Necessary being, wajib al-wujud, is a-causal. Thus, necessary being grounds, so to speak, the fulfillment of all contingent things that depend ultimately on it. Necessary being is, quote unquote, an ultimate doer. It is absolute simplicity of act in action. Everything contingent is a composite, every contingent thing is a composite, a murakkab, of potentiality and actuality, or to use older English terms, potency and act. Al-quwwatu wal-fi'l in traditional Islamic philosophy. The coming into existence of some contingent entity then is an actualization of a potentiality. Necessary being, wajib al-wujud, however, is pure actuality. It has no intrinsic or extrinsic parameters, boundaries, or restrictions. It is capable of unrestrictedly acting in any and all non-contradictory ways. It is thus an all-inclusive entity, an entity or reality that does not exclude anything from itself. Since it unifies all restricted realities, it must be distinct from them in virtue of the restricted boundaries of contingent entities. Nevertheless, it can unify them because it is simpler than they are. Allah is basit. That's what it's, if you do in Arabic, in terms of Arabic, wajib al-wujud is basit. It is not murakkab. It is absolutely simple reality in act, and is at once pure simplicity, pure act, pure power, pure inclusivity, pure being, and pure capacity to unify all things. And Neoplatonic philosophers had a similar kind of idea. You find this in Plotinus's Enneads. Mullah Sadra is very interested in this notion of simplicity, and he has a principle which he states in Arabic: بسيط الحقيقة كل الأشياء. بسيط الحقيقة كل الأشياء, which means that the simplicity of ultimate reality, or the simplicity of truth, or the simplicity of the utterly real is truly all things. There's the root of all things. There's the source of all things. You have to sort of expand on the translation. In any case, 3.2, we argue then that necessary being must be the simplest possible reality. Therefore, it cannot be incompatible with any contingent entity, because it must ground the fulfillment of all the conditions of any contingent entity. Thus, no contingent entity can be incompatible with necessary being. That is to say, necessary being is itself at the highest level of simplicity. Nothing is simpler than it. It is the apex of the pyramid of existence. Hirame Hasti, the pyramid of existence. The utter simplicity of necessary being suggests that it is one in the sense of unique. So, necessary being, and if we use theological language, wajib al-wujud, or if we use theological language, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we often say in English, Allah is one. People who speak Urdu say Allah ek hai. And they mistranslate. Sometimes some translations are mistakenly render Qul huwa Allahu ahad, say He is Allah, fill in the blank, they say the one. Kaho ki Allah ek hai. Say that God is the one in Urdu. One is not really proper translation. I mean, if you wanted to translate that into Urdu, and here, Urdu and Persian often converge, they use a lot of the same words, you would have to say that Allah is not yak, or one, He is yakta, or yagane. Yani Khuda jo hai, yakta hai, yagana hai, ek nahi hai. So God is one, but one not in an arithmetical or numerical sense. He is one in the sense that He is unique. And this is interesting because there are khutbahs, there's at least two khutbahs in Nahj al-Balagha where Imam Ali alayhi salam talks about, I don't remember the exact Arabic, but he says that Allah is one or unique, but not in the sense of adad, not in the sense of number, not in the sense of numeration. And in ancient mathematics, ancient Greek mathematics, and also in ancient Egyptian mathematics, but ancient Egyptians, they had, anyway, let's not talk about the ancient Egyptians right now, but in ancient mathematics, and also in traditional works on mathematics, arithmetic in the Islamic world, the number, what we call the number one in modern mathematics, was not really considered a number in the strict sense. It was considered the source of all numeration, because if you take the number one as an arithmetic unity, it can be multiplied, as it were, through superposition, which is a fancy way of just saying you can add it to itself, and 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, and so forth. Yet, if you think of any number, just name any number off the top of your head, 729. 729 is a number. And you could have 729 jelly beans in a bag, and you could refer to them, that bag of jelly beans. So any multiplicity can also be conceived of as a unity, and it is in that sense that unity is reflected in all things. You can speak of a dozen eggs. There's 12 eggs, but you conceive of it as an aggregate. You have I don't know what the military terms like, what do they call it? You have a unit and a squad and a battalion and a platoon. I don't really even know what numbers that involves. I'm sorry. But it involves a plurality of soldiers conceived of for whatever administrative or strategic purposes as a unity. Or a dozen eggs conceived of as one for the purposes of, accounting and shelving or whatever, packaging, what have you. So in that sense, unity is reflected through all things. It's utterly simple, but it grounds all number in that sense. Geometrically speaking, in the symbolism of geometry, what is a circle in a plane? A circle is the locus of points which is equidistant from a fixed point in a plane. If you go to 3 dimensions, you get a sphere. And that equidistant is the radius of the circle or the sphere if you go to 3 dimensions. Where is the center? Well, the center is there. Can you see it? It's a dot. If you make it with a compass, I don't know if anybody even does this anymore, all this digital nonsense that's out there, but if you actually take a compass and put it down on a piece of paper and draw a circle, I don't know if they actually even teach geometry anymore in school. I homeschool my kids, so they're learning, but you have to draw the thing, and you have to learn how to do a construction. How do you construct a hexagon? How do you construct an equilateral triangle? There are great lessons and great mysteries in this, and the Muslims used to study Aqlidas, Euclid. In fact, most of the Islamic world, in the later period, after Nasir ibn Tusi, who's a great Shi'i scholar, he died in the year 672, they used his edition, his recension, his tahrir, as we say in Arabic, of Euclid. And that was the one that reached Europe. So Euclid is very important. There's deep and profound symbolism there. And in fact, in Platonic circles, people who carried on the traditions of the teaching of Plato, and Platonism is actually a combination of Plato and Aristotle, and they often refer to it as Neoplatonism, but I don't accept this designation. They would study this book as well, and Euclid was considered to be a kind of initiation for them into a kind of higher mystery, which was symbolized in what are known as the Platonic solids. And there's a whole commentary on Euclid by a guy named Proclus. But this is to get off the topic. So the point is that there is a symbolism here. And so that center, at the center of the circle, determines all of the points on the circumference, but it doesn't touch them in any way. Yet, in some way, it is present in all of them. It's almost like a symbolism of tanzih and tashbih, of transcendence and immanence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And anyway, that's an ishara. وَالْكَيِّسُ تَكْفِيهِ الْإِشَارَةِ. So can we prove that the necessary being whose existence we have established is unique? Yes, we can. The necessary being is unique. So if we ask ourselves the question, can there be more than one? Can there be more than one necessary being? Can there be more than one wajib al-wujud? What does that mean? That is equivalent to asking, can there be multiple instantiations of this necessary being? Recall that it was argued that this necessary being is utter simplicity. Thus, our question becomes, can there be multiple instantiations of this necessary being, which is utter simplicity? If the answer is no, then obviously the necessary being is unique, yakta, yagana, ahad. If there were more than one necessary being, then there would be multiple instantiations of necessary being, or in other words, there would be a number of necessary beings, and we can call them I1, I2, I3, IN minus 1, and IN. Let's say we've got a bunch of gods, so to speak, right? However, since necessary being is utter simplicity, this would entail all of the instantiations of necessary being, I1 through IN, we're only considering a finite number right now, to be utterly simple. For there to genuinely be multiple instantiations of necessary being, there would have to be some difference between these hypothetical multiple instantiations of necessary being, I1 through IN. Otherwise, they would be indistinguishable, self-same, and therefore one and only one, and therefore unique. For there to genuinely be some difference between these hypothetical multiple instantiations of necessary being, I1 through IN, there must be some quality, which we call the instantiating factor, F, or some list of factors, call them F subscript I, which are distinct from any of the multiple instantiations of necessary being. Such an instantiating factor F, or factors F subscript I, must exist. If they don't exist, then there wouldn't be multiple instantiations of necessary being, which would mean that these I1 through IN would be indistinguishable, self-same, and therefore one and only one, and therefore unique. The existence of an instantiating factor f, or factors f subscript I, means that each instantiation of necessary being cannot be truly utterly simple. That is to say, each such instantiation of necessary being would have to be unconditioned reality plus an instantiating factor, which means that it cannot be unconditioned, which is to say that it is not necessary being. It becomes murakkab then, it's not basit. Such an instantiating factor f, or factors f subscript I, would also have to be less simple than necessary being in order to admit of real or really possible excluding differences on the same level of simplicity between the hypothetical multiple instantiations of necessary being. Otherwise, these distinct instantiations of necessary being on the highest level will not even arise. Now, since this instantiating factor f, or factors fi, would have to be less simple than necessary being and would have to be intrinsic to or effect every hypothetical multiple instantiation of necessary being, then it would make each instantiation itself less simple than necessary being. Therefore, necessary being would have to be simpler than every instantiation of it, which is a contradiction. Therefore, by what we said in paragraphs 4.0 to 4.6, any second, third, or nth instantiation of necessary being would also have to be less simple than necessary being, which means that necessary being is the absolutely simplest reality, which is to say it is unique. Necessary being stands alone as necessary being. In conclusion, we have established not only that there must be at least one necessary being, but that this necessary being is utterly simple and unique. This necessary being is none other than Allah. Now, of course, we can go through and do all these other attributes and so forth, but that's a whole book, that's a series of lectures. So that is the proof of Ibn Sina. There's a kind of reflection, or not a reflection, but a final remark I have on that, but we can hold off on that because there is a question.
Maybe I missed it, but how do you define something that is utterly simple? What is that?
Something is utterly simple, meaning that it has no composition in any sense. And so you see, in the universe, according to this understanding of philosophy, according to the philosophy of Aristotle, of Ibn Sina, Mullah Sadra, the entire universe, as it were, or any feature of the universe is in some way or another reducible to a composition of some kind. It has parts, whether that is matter or form, to speak in very philosophical terms, or whether that is actuality and potentiality, or what have you, or whether that is quiddity and being, or wujud and mahiya. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not reducible to any kind of composition in this sense. That's what it means. I don't know if I have answered your question. Yes, sir.
In the ayat you will recite, Qul huwallahu ahad.
Yes.
So, in ahad and wahid, what is the difference in Arabic language of these two words?
Well, it depends on context. And here in this context, you can't really use wahid, although wahid is used elsewhere in the Quran. But here, it's specifically referring to the unique character of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He is utterly unique.
Because I heard a speech from Maulana Naqan.
Yes,
He defined ahad as undivisible one, which cannot be divided.
Yes,
So
yes.
That's why I ask.
That's what he means by, I have not heard this speech, but I would infer that what he means by, as you said, indivisible oneness, did you say? That indivisible oneness means utter simplicity. There is no division possible because there is no partition, as it were. There is no tarkib in the Arabic sense. So tarkib in Urdu can mean something else. But there's no composition. It is utterly simple. Yeah. Please.
Why does the instantiating factor have to be less simple? Like, I'm just a little confused on that.
It has to be less simple because if that instantiating factor is some quality, then that quality becomes a part It is divisible, it is distinguishable, it's not utterly simple, and that then distinguishing factor becomes simpler then because it's a part of that thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand what you're saying, I just,
You have to think about it for a while.
you know.
So it means that Allah and it is rules.
That is another discussion, because this is where we get into differences in Islamic theology. We don't our understanding of the divine attributes is that a given attribute is the divine essence conceived of in that mode. It's probably the best way I can say it. But at the same time, it doesn't imply a kind of composition, as it were, in God.
Ma'ali's position in Nahjul Balagha about this.
Well, Imam Ali's position in Nahj al-Balagha, you'd have to go through a lot of different quotations, but the one that everybody knows and the one that comes immediately to mind, I mentioned about divine simplicity. There are at least 2 khutbahs where he specifically refers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's unicity or unity as being unique. But then, in of course the very, very first khutbah in Nahj al-Balagha, there's this idea that Allah is not His attributes, as it were, because if you have an attribute, you signify, not signify. The word is how would we say it in English? You impute a kind of multiplicity in God, which is not correct. Yeah, in the first khutbah. So Ibn Sina was very proud of this proof. He was very happy with this proof, and he thought that it was quite special. And he thought it was quite special in a very specific way. So as I said at the very beginning, Ibn Sina presents this famous proof by contingency in the opening sections of Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat, or the 3rd volume actually. And when I say the 3rd volume, I think I'm referring to the Suleiman Dunya edition. I think I have a footnote on that, so you can read them. Yeah, there's another edition, and they're both in volume 3, aren't they? Yeah, so it's in volume 3, and there's another edition. Anyhow, it's in his book, Remarks and Admonitions. So at the end of that section in Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat, the Remarks and Admonitions, Ibn Sina calls this proof, he gives it the name, the proof of the superbly veracious, or Burhan al-Siddiqeen. And this is what he says, I've translated them. So admonition, in other words, tanbihun. Ponder then now our demonstration of the existence of the First and His uniqueness and transcendence in no way requires recourse to anything but existence itself. So in other words, he's saying that in his proof, he did not resort to causality. He didn't, al-illa wal-ma'lul. He didn't resort to potency and act, or potentiality and actuality, al-quwa wal-fi'l, or any other aspect of the cosmos other than the feature of existence. Nor does it need to consider his creation or his acts, even though these two are evidence of him. This way is the most reliable and the most noble. That is to say, if we consider the state of existing, existence bears witness to him, capital H, inasmuch as he is existence. And then he in turn bears witness to all that succeeds him, as it were, in existence. Indeed, it is to something such as this that the noble book alludes. In Surah Fussilat, so the 41st Surah, 53rd ayah, it says, we shall show them our signs on the horizons and in themselves, until it becomes manifestly clear unto them that He is the truly real. And I began yesterday's lecture with that in Arabic. So it's Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, sanurihim ayatina fil afaqi wa fi anfusihim. We shall show them our signs, sanurihim. We shall show them ayatina, our signs, sanurihim ayatina fil afaqi, on the horizons, wa fi anfusihim, and within themselves, hatta yatabayyana lahum, until it becomes manifestly clear unto them, annahu al-haq, that He, capital H, is the truth, or the utterly real. Then it says, what is it? أَوَلَمْ يَكْفِي بِرَبِّكَ أَنَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ شَهِيدٌ. And does your Lord not suffice you as He is witness over all things? Now, to say that He is witness over all things is what Ibn Sina is alluding to. So he says that the first part, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا, etc., of this ayah is a standard of proof or evidence, according to him, for a particular segment of humanity. That this ayah alludes to or implicitly points to the other kinds of cosmological argument, whereas that He is the witness over all things points to the Burhan al-Siddiqeen in the form that, in this kind of argument that Ibn Sina has presented. And he says, I say, this is a standard for the superbly veracious, that this is a proof which is really only truly fathomed by the Siddiqeen. I mean, you might be able to understand it on a certain intellectual level, but Ibn Sina is saying that if you really, really want to understand it, obviously it demands a certain degree of, a high degree of righteousness and piety. And he says, Siddiqeen who bear witness to His existence directly through Him and by Him, rather than by recourse to something other than Him as a means of pointing to Him. There's a famous hadith of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, which says, "I'rafu Allah billah," know Allah by Allah. Know Allah by Allah. And there are statements of this sort in various du'as as well of the Imams and so forth. What he means to say, though, what Ibn Sina, however, means to say, is that this proof, this kind of cosmological argument based on contingency and necessity, is based on the very fact of existence itself. Or wujud in Arabic, which he then distinguishes as either necessary or contingent, and uses this to establish that God exists necessarily. He deemed this proof to be superior to all others, since it is based on existence itself, and that God is none other than pure existence. God is al-wujudul mahd, pure being, or al-wujudul baht, sheer being. In contrast, other proofs, such as Aristotle's unmoved mover, are based on some aspect of existing things. There's a very famous proof, it's considered the paradigmatic, the model cosmological argument by Aristotle, which is set out in his book, The Physics, in which he speaks of motion. I'm not sure what the Greek word is for motion, but in Latin, when these things were translated into Latin and people like Aquinas and others spoke about this, they would use the Latin word motus. But motus, and in Arabic they'll use the word haraka. But haraka doesn't just mean motion. Motion, if it's translational motion in physics, rectilinear motion, it's change of place, it's change of position, and if you're really strict about it as a vector, it's a displacement. And there's also circular motion, and they had different ways of talking about motion before, but in modern physics is how we would talk about it. So when we translate that as motion and say Aristotle's argument is the unmoved mover, it's not really accurate. What he really means is change. Look around at the universe, change happens, change exists. So you can argue on the basis of change that there must be an unchanging basis for all or ground of all change. That's what Aristotle's proof of the unmoved mover essentially is. But as Ibn Sina says, they're based on some aspect of existing things. In the case of Aristotle, it's based on change. Rather than on what? On wujud itself, existence itself. However, careful consideration of the matter reveals that this proof, and this is my view, Wallahu a'lam, while wholly adequate, does not really fulfill the conditions that Ibn Sina thought it did, while it certainly comes closer than all others. This is due to the fact that while Ibn Sina's proof of the superbly veracious or supremely veracious is indeed based on the fact of existence itself, it is only the notion of existence that he employs rather than the reality of existence. Mafhum al-wujud as opposed to haqiqat al-wujud, and this is a fine distinction, a fine nuance. There's mafhum al-wujud and there's haqiqat al-wujud. This is a crucial distinction, and the task of rising to the challenge implicit in Ibn Sina's attempt at formulating such a proof was left to posterity and remained unrealized until Sadr al-Din Muhammad al-Shirazi established a new school of Islamic philosophy known as Transcendent Wisdom al-Hikmat al-Muta'aliyah, which is the topic of the next section, probably another seminar. It's 6:20 now. So I have a summary also of Mullah Sadra's way of the superbly veracious, the Sabil or the Minhaj, or even if you want to call it the Burhan al-Siddiqeen, the way of the superbly or supremely veracious. But that has a number of preliminaries that are involved beyond logic that have to do with establishing what he calls the primacy or fundamental reality of existence in the external world, or what is known as asalatul wujud. So for Mullah Sadra's proof, to understand Mullah Sadra's proof, you have to first establish asalatul wujud, or the fundamental reality of existence in the external world. You also have to make some argument for, or some attempt to explain the self-evident character of being or existence, or what's called badahatul wujud. That actually comes first. Then asalatul wujud. And then you have to talk about what is called the hierarchy or gradation of being. They usually speak of, in philosophical English influenced by medieval scholasticism, they speak of the analogical or analogicity or analogical gradation of being. They're translating a word from Greek, which is amphibole, and in Arabic it became tashkik, and Mullah Sadra calls it tashkik al-wujud. In other words, there is a kind of infinite range or gradation of being. My colleague Sayyid Sajjad Rizvi at Exeter University calls it the modulation of being. It's kind of bringing in a kind of almost a musical image here, which is simply to say that there is a kind of hierarchy of or gradation of being akin to light, which is an imagery which was introduced by Suhrawardi, and that Allah is the most intense and perfect degree, so to speak, of being. And so then he uses these notions and in the form of propositions, on proposition 1, the self-evident character of being. Proposition 2, for example, the next proposition is the fundamental reality of being in the external world, the analogical gradation of being. On the basis of all this, then he argues that Allah is the perfection or the utterly perfect sort of reflection of being in that range, outside of that range, in fact. And that is, establishes, the existence of God. But people have, even like Allama Tabatabai, Al-Allama, as he is known, Tabatabai, most people know him as the author of Tafsirul Mizan, very well known. There's a full Persian translation. I think there's Urdu, maybe by now. There might even be partial English, or maybe even full English, I don't know. It exists. Well, he wrote a lot of books. He was a very profoundly learned man, and he has made many he has made many little marginal notes on many important books, including Bihar al-Anwar. But it's not throughout the whole of Bihar al-Anwar. Bihar al-Anwar is 110 volumes in hadith. He had little glosses on that in the beginning volumes. But he has notes on the whole book of Mullah Sadra, the big book of Mullah Sadra, his largest work, which is Kitab al-Asfar al-Arba'a. It's the usual title, most well-known title form of the title. In other words, the four journeys. And Allama Tabatabai has glosses, little footnotes and marginal notes. So in volume 6, it's in 9 volumes. There's 2 editions. There's a newer edition and an older edition. The older edition is the one that has the comments of Allama Tabatabai and other very, very important people. The new edition only has the comments of Mullah Hadi Sabzavari, and they put them at the end of the volume. They don't have them in the bottom in the footnotes. So Allama Tabatabai in volume 6, where Mullah Sadr talks about this Burhan al-Siddiqeen, talks about how because existence is already assumed within the proof, because it starts by saying that there is some externally existent thing, or waq'iyya kharijiyya, an external existential reality, and argues on that basis. Allama Tabatabai says that this is actually a burhan, but only a burhan. It's really a burhan inni. It's actually a kind of proof that has that. To get into the technical details is too complex here, but let's say it's a certain kind of argument. And So he says that's what kind of argument is it, which is not really the best kind of burhan. And some logicians don't like this kind of a burhan, and they prefer the different kind. And so he says it's not really, strictly speaking, a burhan, by which he means a burhan limmi, but it's probably the best burhan inni, or closest to a burhan limmi as you can get. That's the gist of what he says. And I didn't have my asfar here. I can't carry around 9 volumes. It would be nice if you could, but there's only so much baggage you can carry. So I checked that gloss here. I found a PDF of it and checked it before I came. So that's the gist of what he says. It's in volume 6, page, where is this? Yani, page 13. Yeah. So it's volume 6. If you want to go and read it in the Arabic. Page 13, footnote 1. وَهُوَ مَعَ ذَلِكَ بُرْهَانٌ إِنِّي, etc., etc. Okay, so that's what I have to say for now. And now we can discuss and have question, answer, if you like. Before we open up the floor for questions, I should take a moment before I forget to thank you all for suffering through this, and especially those of you who came yesterday as well. Yesterday was a bit livelier, but this, as I told you yesterday, this would be a difficult and arduous intellectual journey. So I thank you for your patience and listening. I would like to thank Sayyid Ali Rida also for facilitating all of this, and I would like to thank all of the admin of IEC Husaini, and I would like to thank as well your resident alim, Sayyid Mahbub Mahdi as well, for inviting me and having me here. And we can ask questions then.
Before we start, I'm gonna pass this around. If you guys can put your email address on this, I'll forward the link to the document if you don't have it already. Also, this is kind of a just evaluations and honest evaluation of this is seminar. We're trying, this is one of the first times we're putting this together, and we're trying to see, we want to get your feedback as much as we can. So I'm gonna pass this around. If you can please,
How do they give you their
email address? I'm gonna send out a survey or something anonymous.
So this document,
Just,
this document was uploaded, right? And a link was made available because my summary of Mullah Sadra's argument is also there, and you can read it. But it's pretty involved, and I think people have probably had enough of.
when you upload the YouTube video, we're gonna put a link to the document on those 2 videos.
You will, okay.
And so if you want to get it from them, but also if you give me your email, I'll send the links and also the survey.
Yeah. So the recording from yesterday has been posted yet, or not on YouTube, or
I want to make some edits to it.
edits to it? Okay, good. So it will be there. You can go back and after you've had something to eat and watch it again.
How would you answer this
Please.
question? If an 8th grader, 9th grader, 10th grader is stuck up with a classmate who is arguing that there's no God, why you guys believe in a God?
Mhm.
Most simplistic way for a naive person who's not too much knowledgeable in philosophy or in anything, what your 1 or 2 sentences will be to subdue somebody's argument that there's no God.
Well, let me put it to you this way: if you have an 8th or 9th grader, and he wants to ask you why matrix multiplication. In matrix multiplication, AB does not equal BA, and he doesn't really know anything about matrices and so on and so forth. You can't give an answer in 1 or 2 sentences. It's just not possible. As I said, people often ask a question. They often ask certain questions, and they aren't really prepared to get the answer. And in our modern age, we just want everything in a sound bite. Can you give me a link, and can I watch a 2-minute video on it on YouTube? It just doesn't work that way. You can't just... I heard there was some... You can't... This could not have been on... Let me put it this way. There's a reason this was a 2-day seminar and not a Snapchat video or a tweet. Tweet is what, 100, I'm not on Twitter, I despise Twitter, but I think it's 140 characters or something.
Yeah, but there is a limitation. Yes.
There's a limitation. It's not possible for you, say, just in 1 or 2 sentences and in simple language, prove to me that God exists.
I make a comment on that?
Please,
So-
this is a free comments now. It's
Father of Tricus, and my oldest is a freshman, right?
a freshman in high school, your oldest, or in college?
Freshman in high school.
Freshman, ninth grade.
I'm also a teacher in Sunday school, and I teach 8th grade.
Mm-hmm.
So to all the parents, I would say, one of the reasons we are having some trouble answering that question, because we don't know ourselves, right? Because we have accepted, and we talked about it yesterday, we accepted that what we are told by our parents and by our grandparents, that this is it. There's a God, go believe in it. But one thing we should be asking ourselves, do I really believe in God? Or is it really just because I follow a culture and just a traditional, it's a tradition for me, right? So what I did, and I asked, I knew that because I was ready, I knew because my kids, my Sunday school kids were asking this question.
Right. Yeah.
I had to be ready, and I knew my kids were going to be asking the same question. So before he asked the question, I had to find my own answers. And and well, the reason why I'm here, because I want to add to that knowledge as well. And it turns out I have to do a lot more before I get to this level. In short, we got to ask ourselves, why do we believe in that? And then once you have this answer, it'll be a lot easier to explain to you.
Yeah. I think there's another, if I may make another point, people like Ibn Sina, people like Mullah Sadra in the Muslim world, in Muslim intellectual history, Al-Farabi, and even in the Jewish world, Maimonides, Aquinas in the Christian world, these people who lived centuries ago, they weren't making these proofs for the existence of God or constructing these arguments because there were 30,000 atheists living in their village that they had to, or their town, or there weren't like 50,000 atheists walking around Baghdad that they had to be dealt with, or Isfahan or wherever. It was simply a philosophical and a kind of intellectual exercise which strengthened their iman, and in the sense that they were, in this kind of a proof, this is where you want to try and establish rational arguments, not on the basis of revelation, independent of revelation. And that's why you had all of these important figures from the different religions who had very similar proofs, because if you put all scriptural evidences and sources aside and say, let's prove on the basis of just our mind, it can be done, but it's an involved exercise. But you can, and then you say, well, if you have a child or an 8th grader, you specifically said 8th or 9th grade, so, but a young person, a person who has not studied philosophy, and there are different kinds of young people. Some are doing advanced calculus in 8th grade. They're going to take the AP or whatever. You have such people, but actually, Sayyid, you had a very good explanation, and I don't think I could do justice and say it as eloquently as you did that day when we were talking. Your daughter asked you, and you gave the example of love. Would you be so kind to share that with our
I think like you said, there are many arguments for the existence of God, and this way he's trying to explain is that this was a proof that they needed to put out on paper in history to stand as a criterion that this is a document proof of the existence of God. It's one of the
and it's a burhan, which means that every proposition is certain.
Yeah.
So it's a very high level of rigor. But when you're talking to your daughter, you use the example of love. That's a proof, but it's not a burhan, proof in the sense of burhan, but it works.
Yes, just going from that is, when I have a mathematical equation equals mc squared, there's a huge proof that goes with that. There's a lot that goes with it. There's a lot of theory, there's a lot of fundamentals, there's a lot of context that goes into it, but that's the essential thing that needs to be made. And now in order to understand that, you need to have all this context. That's not the only way to prove God. So I give you the example, I asked my daughter, this is probably around, she was 3 at the time.
Do you want the mic? Can everybody hear it?
I think I'm good.
Okay.
So I think she was about 3, maybe 4 at the time, and I asked her this question just to see where she's at, because she knows about God and everything. I asked her, is God real? And she's like, yeah, he's real. then she always used to always ask me, why can't we see God? Why can't we see? And our belief in our mother of Shia Islam is that we can't see God. He's beyond that faculty of being seen.
Yeah.
So then she started saying, okay, if you can't see him, then he's not real, right? I said, no, he's absolutely real. And I gave the example. I said, now tell me, is love real? And she looks at me. She said, yeah, it's real. Now show me, where is love? I can't see it. And she's like, and I told her that just like that concept, you can't see love, but you know you can experience it. The same way God is experienced. God is, and she understood right away. She understood right away. And it's funny is, I would say, a few months later, I see her talking to some other kids, and there's kids are talking about what God looks like and all that, and she starts yelling at them and saying, "You can't see God. God's like love. It's like he's like, you can't see him, And the interesting thing is that's a good example because love is one of Allah's sifat. He's one of His names,
Exactly.
and that's just understanding.
Al-Wadud, the all-loving.
Yeah. So to understand this, there's so many proofs for God. There are people that get it. If we have iman, we see God everywhere. You see too many proofs for God. You see the leaves, you see the trees, you see all that type of stuff. You see God everywhere, right? But now there's some people that are blinded by this. They need something concrete that they can hold in their hands, and they can say, okay, now refute this mathematical theory, which is mathematical proof, right? Refute this. Once you can refute it, then you can refute what it says.
Yeah.
Right? This is for those people. Not everybody needs this. Some people do.
But there are also, I think it was Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam, who was asked one time by one of these people, what's the proof for how do you prove that God exists? And he didn't give this proof, obviously. He didn't give this argument that we've gone through. He just gave a simple example because remember, he's the Imam, he's the Masoom. Again, he knows the situation. He knows how to answer the person in the way that the person will understand. And so you also have to have that. Of course, we're not Masoomin, but if we're talking to someone that we know and we know their background and their history, because they're our friend or our relation or our colleague, we can address that person's concern, so to speak, in a way that they would find convincing. It's also like what Imam Ali alayhi salam said to speak to people on the level of their intellect. And so I was going to give you an example from Imam Ja'far alayhi salam. So this person asks him, and then he says, well, have you ever been on a ship? Did you ever sail on a ship before? And he said, yeah. And he said, well, what happens when the ship is hit by a serious storm? And he says, well, people call out. Well, who do they call out to? He says, that's Allah, that's God. And you think, well, maybe, if you, a lot of people, if you tell them that, they think, that's just naive, especially modern sort of secular people. But let me share an interesting anecdote with you. Back in 2009, I went to Istanbul with my family. We went on a vacation there. And it was very interesting. It was 2000. I think it was 2000. Anyway, it doesn't matter exactly. It was some years ago. And we also wanted to go to a place called Cappadocia. That's far from Istanbul, so we took a flight. Now, because of the geological features of the terrain there and the time of year and the temperature and so forth, there was a lot of hot air rising, so there was a tremendous amount of turbulence. I have flown a lot on airplanes in my life since I was a kid, and maybe I've read too much science. I don't really get maybe as scared as I should when the plane starts shaking. And the plane really started shaking, though. Really, really shaking. And as usual, I was reading a book, and and this has happened many times. We're flying somewhere, and there'll be some turbulence. My wife just completely freaks out, and she'll say, "No, dua padiye." I said, "Just leave me alone. I'm reading the kuch nahi hoga." She says, "You've got to recite some du'as or something. The plane is going to crash." And over the years, all the time, I thought, "No, this is nothing." That was the one time I thought, this plane actually might crash. And so I ignored it again, but then it just wouldn't stop shaking. So then I had to shut my book. But then what really caught my attention was the whole plane, everybody on the plane, the people were screeching and they were almost crying. It was quite a scene. And I thought, are these guys all so religious? Because there's some very, people, there weren't, people who were identifiably Muslim on the plane. It's mainly just sort of foreign people. And who knows what their belief is? You can't, unless you have kashf, you can't tell by looking at them. But at that point, everybody had kashf, and they all suddenly became believers in God. And no, I listened for a while, and what were they saying? Oh my God, that's what they say. And they really meant it, maybe for one of the first times in their life, probably in some cases. And people were praying, including me. And then, of course, everything, alhamdulillah, and we landed, and everybody forgot about it.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. And I thought about what Imam Jafar said at that time, and then we were riding in the taxi. I said to my wife, "Dekhiye, Imam Jafar ki hadith hai, dekhiye." I said, "You remember that hadith? We exactly saw it now." And it's interesting. So, take the kid up in a plane and put it in a stall and see what happens.
This is
Yeah.
a very different anecdote, but it's similar to this. I've heard this, as they say it in jest. That anytime someone's gambling, they become deeply religious. Because they have...
Gambling?
Yeah, because they have money on the line. They're like, oh yeah, I don't think and it's obviously in this case, this is an intensely wrong act, but if you think about it,
Yeah,
if you think about it, it's true.
yes.
People become very religious around like a poker table and stuff like that, because they want that, to pray to God for a certain card to come up and stuff.
Luck, isn't it? Because
Yeah, of course, it's all probability, but they don't, if they thought that way, they would actually, once you feel that, or have this on the line, be whatever they have love for, in this case, money. And they're gonna start praying for it.
Yeah.
There was a book in Arabic, it is translated in English also a few years ago,
Yes.
At-Tawheed, that has come across your...
Well, that's a very general title. Do you know who's the author? It could be, if you mean a famous sort of book in our Shia tradition, then it's a Shaykh al-Saduq. It's a Kitab al-Tawheed lis-Saduq, or Tawheed al-Shaykh al-Saduq. It's a very well-known book, yeah. I didn't know there was an English translation.
There is. If you want it, I can.
Oh, that's very kind of you, but yeah. Actually, now that I think about it, there is a PDF. I downloaded it once because
Which book is it?
yeah. The Kitab al-Tawheed by Shaykh al-Saduq. Yes, I've come across it. It's a very well-known book. There are a lot of hadiths. There are very, very important hadiths on different aspects of the divine unity, and a lot of that material is also reproduced in Al-Kafi collection as well. So,
Just for the naive person, once I thought
Yeah.
a simple logic
Mhm.
that you can ask him that, do you sit in a car?
Mhm.
So yes,
Mhm.
I can ask him that, what about the car?
Mhm.
There's somebody who sometimes, maybe 100 years or 200 years, came up with an idea of making a car.
Mhm.
Some person who actually manufactured, and the car itself is different from the manufacturer.
Mhm.
Originator.
Indeed.
founder.
Indeed.
The same way, take the same example to everything else on the earth. Everything else on the earth did not come by itself. Somebody is an originator. Something is an originator.
You are absolutely right.
So
Yep.
that probably made link,
Mhm.
right from, for example, can give an example of a pen,
Mhm.
telephone,
Mhm.
Apple phone. Somebody is an originator of Apple phone. And the same as somebody, something, some entity got to be an originator of the entire universe.
Mhm.
And now we know there is not only one universe, there are millions of universes. There are more than one universe.
Mhm.
So how about that?
Mhm.
So person who can create one car can create 20 different cars. In the same way, the creator of the universe can also create multiple universes. How about that?
Yes.
It's linked to something which is
Mhm.
infinite,
Yes. Yes.
where
Yes.
human beings cannot actually reach.
Mhm.
They cannot go there. That's what the God is.
Yes, that's very well said. I mean, that's a cosmological argument. And we just presented a very, very involved and rigorous version of that. The only observation or issue which I would like to bring up is when you say we know now that there are multiple universes, we know now that proposition is simply not true. There are physicists who claim and speak of something called the multiverse theory, but there is as yet not one shred of empirical evidence to back up that theory. It is merely a mathematical abstraction involved in mathematical physics, which they have, and so as such it is a hypothesis. And the word in English, universe, means the totality of all that exists. And so to speak of a multi-universe is something of a contradiction linguistically. But anyway, this is a very minor point. Essentially what you have said is quite true. And that's really the cosmological argument on some notion of causality, cause and effect. Yes?
I have a small question. So the proof that you pulled up earlier, I walked in late, so maybe you mentioned.
Yes, please do avail yourself of the document and read it and
No, yeah, I
consider it carefully.
I
Yes.
just had a question. Was the proof, so he wrote the proof just as a general explanation, meaning it wasn't just like solely restricted to Islam, it was for like a monotheistic belief that there's one God. So that like this proof could be understood by...
Yes, this proof can be understood by anyone. Ibn Sina essentially makes this argument on the distinction between contingency and necessity. He didn't have all the symbols and all this and spreading it out. But if you would go and study one of these books in a traditional context, when they're teaching it in Arabic, they would have a back and forth like this, and they would flesh, I would hope, they would flesh out the argument much, much more. Because even if you read traditional books of theology, okay, in Arabic, our books, in Hausa books. So if you would read Tajreed al-I'tiqad by Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi, who died in 672 of the Hijrah, I just translated that book into English. It's a thin book, written in very telegraphic English. And then there is about a 600-page commentary on it by Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi's student, Al-Allama al-Hilli, who's the only person, who was the first person in history actually to be known as Ayatullah and probably actually deserved it. He writes a 600-page commentary on it. And when you go and you read the proof, so Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi is just saying that everything either is necessary or contingent. If it's necessary, we're done. If it's contingent, it leads to an infinite regress, and infinite regress is impossible, therefore God exists. What I said in, 10 pages or whatever, that's what he says in one line. So then Al-Allama al-Hilli elaborates on it, but again, Al-Allama al-Hilli is not writing for the average person. So he writes maybe a paragraph or a couple of pages. I don't remember, I don't have the book in front of me. So then you can read that and then you can flesh it out more. But again, Al-Allama al-Hilli is also writing for people who have attained to a certain level of education in that system. And you can elaborate these out more and more. I don't know that Muslims have written books of a similar nature, for example, like this New Proofs for the Existence of God. I remember I once asked my friend, Sayyid Sajjad Rizvi, and he said that he wasn't aware of anything like this. I think Sajjad probably ordered the book. Maybe he did, I don't know, but I did send him a link for it. I asked some other colleagues of mine, and maybe there are things in Persian. Sajjad, I remember he emailed me back saying that, I think that Allama Javadi Amali maybe has a book on it, but I've never seen it. I don't have a PDF of it. There are other books. These are interesting to read. Because people asked me, this is a very interesting book and it's relatively inexpensive. It's called 5 Proofs of the Existence of God by Edward Feser, F-E-S-E-R. It's a pretty good book. It's very well written. He is, however, a Catholic philosopher. But again, there's no Christian theology in there. There's stuff, and he admits also that basic theism Muslims agree in as well. I don't really think he has a very kind opinion of Muslims, but this is a very well written book. We have to be fair. Also, there was someone who asked a question yesterday. I don't know, maybe that person will watch the video once it's uploaded, so I have to answer this person's question. I should have done this at the beginning, but it slipped my mind. They asked me about this book. So this book is called Does God Exist? Where's the question? Oh, the question mark is here. Yes. And I mentioned it was by Kai Nielsen and another person. So this is the book. This is an older book that there was an actual debate that took place between theists and atheists. And the whole debate was then written down and transcribed, and then there are articles for and against. But it's a much more Christian book because it gets into all certain specific theological questions as well. But it's interesting to read. Yes.
So, first, thanks for going through this very important proof.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
I think it is a proof that actually really Ibn Sina's time as much as it is kind of our time in terms of like especially academic culture and those kind of things. I couldn't find an equivalent term for atheism the way it's being practiced today.
You won't.
In the Quran or in any of the.
Oh, I was going to say in history in the Quran. Yes, well, okay.
Even in the, like even the word kufr, any of these are not the same thing, right? Like for example, there's a verse that says, if you ask them who created the heavens and earth, they'll say Allah, you know, or like the classic deist position, or. So really, what we really are debating is the attributes, and we're really the real cultural wars, if you will, is the relationship with God. Who is God?
Now or in the Quran? Now you mean in our particular historical moment?
At this particular moment, I think the doctrines and all these are like low-hanging fruit. These are not the real challenges of our time. The real challenge of our time is issues like love or relationship or kind of things of, you know, trying to really make those proofs palatable to people. I mean, I really appreciate like the mathematical proofs, but I also think, is there an algorithm for love? Is there a similar kind of proof for the existence of love that we can leverage in today's world? Because I think
We need a proof for the existence of love since when?
No, an algorithm.
I don't understand. I mean, that's probably one thing, you know, I'm sure Richard Dawkins loves something. He loves his job. He loves his career. One would hope he loves his wife. I don't know. I mean, is that something that is in need of proof? That's something which every human being, as say Rida says, even a child understands it. And you can't see it, but you feel.
Why am I obligated to love this guy?
That, now I understand. Why?
Why is he wajibul wudud?
Well, wajib would be, but anyway, yeah.
Is there something, and wajib might not
That's
be
a good
the
term.
best term here, but
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just thinking out loud, that there's, somehow we are not the carriers of the love, the way other faiths have become kind of the carriers of the love.
And what other faith do you?
Like for example, Christianity has really marketed itself, for lack of a better term.
They've marketed, they've said that, and they've gone out and decimated entire nations and peoples. I mean, we're living on the bones of the innumerable American Indian tribes who were destroyed here. The black African races were enslaved for centuries here in the United States, and they continue to be persecuted, and they're a permanent underclass, and they burned I don't know how many people at the stake. I think Christianity, by which I mean that which ultimately goes back to someone named Paul and has little or nothing to do with the original teaching of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, historically has a lot to answer for. And so this notion that they're all about love and so on and so forth, I think is really, really, really a stretch, my dearest friend. I really don't accept that. And no, marketing is just lying.
Sometimes you can
Advertising and marketing is just propaganda.
Historical reality. I'm talking about. Let's just stick to.
No, it's not love either. I mean, I'll give you an example. People talk about Mother Teresa. All right, this is actually where Hitchens was absolutely right, Christopher Hitchens. He wrote a book against Mother Teresa, and he was trying to be very provocative. So I don't even want to say the title. It's a very impolite title. I mean, it has a double meaning, and I don't want to say it. But he raises some very important questions there. You know, she was there in Calcutta, or Calcutta, if you're like, and I was Calicut, and she had a tremendous amount of money and donations, and the Catholic Church is not just rich, it is filthy rich. And then she had donations of astronomical sums from known dictators and people of various, very suspect political people like Baby Doc Duvalier of Haiti. And what did she do with the money? She could have built the best teaching hospital in South Asia with that money, and she didn't. Instead, the Catholic Church is marketing despair. You have a human being in a truly lamentable and wretched state, rotting away in a bed somewhere with a terminal illness in their own waste matter. And what does she do? She just comes and waves a cross over them and asks them to accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior because of John 3:16. I really don't like that. And now they say she's a saint and they market this whole thing. So when they talk about love, where is the love, I say to them? If you want to help someone, truly, then you help them without any regard of whether they're going to be Christian or not, or whether you want them to accept this whole Trinitarian story, which is what it's really about.
But you could cast that same critique on every institutional religion in the world.
No, I don't think so. I don't think Muslims went into the deepest heart of Black Africa, as they called it then in the 19th century, to carrying the white man's burden to go and convert all these naked natives who just sit around, as Boris Johnson recently said about Uganda, in a corner, just shooing away the flies from their face.
Yeah, but we slaughtered the Ahlul Bayt.
It wasn't we.
Yeah, no, I mean, I take that as a kind of a reflection on ourselves, that, you know, religion is not just a tribal flag. You know, if we're talking about the truth, if we're talking about trying to get...
Well, that's not Islam. That's some sort of Umayyad, Sufyanid, Jahiliyyah, which in modern times is manifested by the Al Saud and their ilk.
But we have to make
That's not Islam.
We have to make a distinction between critiquing tribal affiliates of these ideas and the ideas themselves.
Mhm.
Right? I mean, these are all manifestations throughout time that have claimed these terms, claimed these ideas. You know, because these proofs do not exist in a vacuum. They're people. Ultimately, they're people on the ground that are enacting them. So we cannot do this. No idea exists outside of a manifestation in this world. So it's not something that we can. It's not intellectually honest to do that, you know, across time, or to single out one group over another and try to get into like some kind of oppression Olympics and see who's more virtuous over time. Because
I'm not involved in oppression Olympics. I think these are historical facts. The historical record of Christianity is very well documented. And I really don't see the point you're trying to make.
the point I was trying to originally make was I was asking about you know, intellectual polemics are one thing, and the relational proofs are another, or they could be complementary in some ways. And you know, and I was trying to give an example of how Christianity has kind of marketed itself around love, and then you went around to try to unpack that and say, well, it's not really love. Okay, that's a different issue. I'm talking about...
How is it a different issue? It seems to be central to your point.
No, because you're positioning the Muslim world as kind of being innocent of all oppression, all crime, and Christianity somehow is being indicted.
No, I didn't say that.
Being hypocrites of that very love.
I didn't speak about the Muslim world.
I wasn't talking about the reality of it.
No, I didn't speak about the Muslim world. You gave the example of Christianity, and I challenged that without any reference to the Muslim world. It would be true, regardless of whether Islam existed or not. This is what the Christians did. This is what the Catholic Church did.
That's what the Catholic Church did.
Well, all right. The Protestants did.
Idea.
As I said, when I said by Christianity, I mean Christianity as an outgrowth of the teaching of Paul, and that has its manifestation in the Catholic Church, it has its manifestation in the Protestant churches, and it also has its manifestation in the Orthodox. That should cover all existing sects of Christianity under those three general rubrics.
Yeah, but if we're going to you know, basically essentialize a whole religion as being kind of antithetical to a certain position, just because, you know, I mean, you're going to say the teachings of Paul is what caused all of this kind of...
I think that you can draw. I think you can draw a straight line from Paul to the Spanish Inquisition, just as I think you can draw a straight line from Abu Bakr to Muhammad ibn Salman.
Well, I mean, I have a hard time drawing a straight line, but for these kinds of issues, I think more.
Well, a metric, I don't know, take a manifold, take what you want, a connection. I see a direct connection, yeah. Anyway, yes, Naveed.
Just had a historical question about the Quran. Was this proof only defended by Imami theologians or also Sunni theologians historically? And I mean, today in the Hausa, like many Shia students have wide exposure to this proof.
Mhm.
They might not understand it, but they have exposure to it.
Yeah.
Is that the case with Sunni Quds?
I'm not aware, but many people commented on the works of Ibn Sina, not just Shia people, and so there might be something. I'm not aware of it, and so I don't have an answer to that question. There may be, but I just simply don't know. I can't think of any, but that doesn't mean there weren't. How would you research that? You'd have to find, okay, so you take the al-isharat wa tanbihat, and then you have to research, you'd have to look into the different commentaries, because the well-known commentary on it is by Nasiruddin al-Tusi. Now there was another commentary by Sunni named Fakhruddin al-Razi, and he tended to disagree with him a lot. And so if you found if you consulted his commentary and went to the relevant portion, he might have something to say on it. And then there's probably other commentaries, and they might be published or they may not be published. And if you wanted to figure that out, you'd have to go and look in something like Brockelman, or there's Kashf al-Dhunun. You go to Kashf al-Dhunun, you would check there, see if it lists any commentaries. You go to Brockelman, Karl Brockelman, Geschichte der arabischen Literatur, and see if there's anything there. But that lists manuscripts. You go to library catalogs, which are online available, and then you go and consult all those and see what you find. That could be an interesting MA. Why don't you think about doing it? Or at least a really good research paper. Was there somebody else that he just got up and left? Did he have the gentleman, the mathematician have I forget his name. I guess he had to go. Yes. Do we still need this? I don't think we need this.
You brought up that atheists think that the belief in God is irrational. Why would they believe that?
Yesterday I brought up that atheists believe that the belief in God is irrational.
Yes.
Okay, well, they offer all sorts of evidences, but the person who I was quoting was specifically George H. Smith in his book Atheism, The Case Against God. So I only quoted him when he was defining and clarifying what he meant by atheism. But when he says the case against God, if you read the introduction, he says that he's specifically arguing against the Christian God. And so after he defines what atheism is, in part, what he calls the first part of the book, he has all of this stuff against Christianity. A lot of what I said, the atheists also argue against the Christian God. So they talk about the history of Christianity. Then they talk about all the contradictions within especially Christian theology, Trinity, so on and so forth, original sin. A lot of things which Muslims say as objections to that. So that's how he did it. But typically, this is what atheists do. They say that belief in God is irrational for many reasons, aside from any particular theological conception of God or specific teachings by Christianity or Judaism or Islam. Atheists tend to be completely in favor of scientism, which means that they espouse a kind of extreme rationalism and extreme empiricism. Do you understand what I mean by those terms? That, in other words, empiricism means that there are only that which can be experienced by the senses or the extension of the senses is real. So extension of the senses means various kinds of scientific instrumentation, medical light on X-ray machines, telescopes, all sorts of detectors, and so on and so forth. They're extensions of al-hawas al-khamsa, hawas al-panjgana, the five senses. And they say, God, you can't see God. And so they take a kind of approach of the so-called scientific method, where God is seen as a hypothesis, and we have to find empirical evidence, in other words, evidence on the basis of our five senses and the extensions thereof that God exists. And it is their claim that there is no such thing. Smith also goes further, and this is more a Christian thing, where Christians, he doesn't really specify, and he's also sort of in a certain way misrepresenting the Christian perspective as well, with all due respect and all fairness to Christians. And this is what they often do when they talk about theists or a particular religion. They do it what's called in argument and critical thinking and logic, constructing a straw man. Do you know what that means? You know what a scarecrow is?
Yeah.
Right? So the birds, they see the form and they fly away, but you and I know that it's not real. And so it's kind of stupid to go and start boxing with a scarecrow, but you could. So what they do is they construct a straw man. In other words, they construct a caricature, a cartoon-like image of the theist or a particular doctrine by oversimplifying it, presenting it in a simplistic way, or misrepresenting it in some other fashion, and then they shoot it down. So he says that Christians claim that God is ultimately unknowable, or which is not. Christians are confused also. Muslims don't say this either. Muslims say that it's the divine essence which is utterly unknowable, but Allah is known through His attributes. So he says that something which is completely unknowable just doesn't exist, which is also a bit of a stretch because he doesn't seem to see. Because, as we say in Islamic philosophy, عدم الوجدان لا يدل على عدم الوجود. If you can't experience something, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Tomorrow, if we just, for a long time, Uranus was not known to exist, and somebody sees it in a telescope, therefore it is. Was it there before the guy looked at it in his telescope? Yes, it was. But then he would say, well, it's not unknowable. It became known at some point in the future. It wasn't known at one time, so it's not utterly unknowable. Anyhow, so this is the kind of stuff they do. These are examples of why they say that belief in God is irrational. I don't know if that answers your question or points you in the right direction. Yes?
We had a discussion. There was a young gentleman who had posed the question about God creating something stronger.
Yeah, can God create a rock that He cannot lift? It's a well-known thing, yeah, go on.
And let me know if I'm misstating you. You said that God doesn't do anything contradictory to
He doesn't act in contradictory ways, and that's a contradiction, because as you spoke with him, and you did it very nicely and very eloquently, that that's a contradiction. And anyway, so you're going somewhere else now. So let's see where you're going.
I just wanted to ask about that. I'll call it a proposition, but let me.
It is a proposition. It is
that God does not act in
God
contradictory. Is that
does
an
not
assumption,
act.
Or is that something that Islamic philosophy proves in some way?
Yes, it has to, because you see, God only acts in non-contradictory ways. All right. The law of non-contradiction is or the law of contradiction, they also call it the law of non-contradiction, is absolutely important. It's called al-Qadaya by Ibn Sina in the Kitab al-Shifa, in the relevant place. And why is it al-Qadaya means the mother of all sort of propositions, the origin of all propositions. Because if you don't accept the law of non-contradiction, in other words, something is either true or false. That's it. And that's actually law of excluded middle. The law of contradiction is something is either a proposition cannot be true and false at the same time. That's the law of non-contradiction or contradiction. So P cannot be not P at the same time in the same fashion. So what that means is it comes down to, that's a logical law, but it also has an ontological correlate. In ontology or being, the science of being, it has a correlate, which is that something cannot exist and not exist at the same time in the same way. Do you understand? So Allah is pure existence, you see. So He doesn't contradict Himself. And He doesn't act in contradictory ways. And in logic, if you deny the law of contradiction, you cannot argue with a person. It's meaningless, because there is no basis for discussion. In fact, he contradicts his own position by saying that there is no law of contradiction. And from the point of view of ontology and metaphysics, the great modern sage of Iran from Khorasan, Sayyid Jalaluddin Ashtiani, said in a very important book of his called Hasti as nazar falsafe or irfan in Persian, he talks about this. And that book that he wrote is a kind of his elaboration of Mullah Sadra's Kitab al-Mashahir, or the Book of Metaphysical Prehensions. And he says that just as the law of contradiction is al-Qadaya, or the root and origin and mother, so to speak, of all logical propositions in ilm al-mantiq and in science of logic, so also in ontology, the notion of the self-evident character of existence or being or wujud, badahatul wujud, is the root proposition or the root postulate, because it can't really be proved. It has to be accepted, and we know within somehow that it's true. And if we reject it, it leads to all sorts of contradictions. So if you reject the law of non-contradiction, it leads to all sorts of problems. Similarly, if you reject the self-evident character of being, or badahatul wujud, and you know the 19th century representative of the school of transcendent wisdom, al-Hikmat al-Muta'aliya, Mullah Hadi Sabzavani, says in the Manzuma, which is a poem he wrote on metaphysics and the school of Mullah Sadra, he says, معرف الوجود شرح الاسم وليس بالحد ولا بالرسم مفهومه من أعرف الأشياء وكنهه في غاية الخفاء. Which means that all defining terms of existence, معرف الوجود شرح الاسم, are but explications of the word, the name. مفهومه من أعرف الأشياء, the notion, the mental notion of wujud or existence is known by everyone. Even President Clinton, when he said, it depends on what the meaning of is. Everyone understands what is meant by something existing. So everyone has this notion of existence. But existence itself cannot be defined because it is involved in every definition. It is the very basis of all predication. So all the attempts to define existence are just repetitions of or uses of synonyms for existence. It's like you say a car is a vehicle, is an automobile. You're not adding anything. So if you say that existence is, if you say wujud is ما يمكن الإخبار عنه, as Nasir ad-Din Tusi says that this is one of the, in Tajrid al-I'tiqad, this is one of the definitions which is attempted of being. In other words, that which is capable of predication is simply to say existence. That which can be perceived, to perceive is a thing is to say that it exists. So all attempts to define existence are going to fail. And that has to be accepted, and you can't deny it. So Ashtiani mentions this there, and then he talks about lots of other things, you know, in terms of how wujud was understood in philosophy and how it was understood in irfan, or the kind of Islamic gnosis, for want of a better term.
Are there any other questions?
12 minutes after 7, I think.
Minutes.
Thank you for all the
Thank you very much again for your patience.